Let's go inside Flinders Aluminum for a moment. For those of you that have never been on the factory floor, it's frantic. The machines are going full force. On one side of the factory, you've got men with acetylene torches cutting through large sheets of metal. On the other side, you've got men manning industrial saws that are slicing through sheets of metal. On another side, you've got men pounding the metal down. Everywhere, sparks are flying, hot metal shavings are going everywhere. In the dead of winter, that factory floor is 80 to 90 degrees. It is hot, stifling work. Have you look at that again because of the technology problems. This is what aluminum fabrication looks like. Hot, stifling work. And there are chemical drums, ones that store hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is caustic to the touch. They take out a little bit each day to clean the machines, the pieces of metal that have literally melted into the face of the machinery. If you put this thing in lead-lined drums, it will eat through them in a matter of hours. If you're unlucky enough to get it on your skin, it'll burn through in a matter of seconds. One mistake, it's combustible. You have to store it in special plastic-lined drums like this. And those spouts, those seals, they're all a little bit tricky. On November 16th, the factory was on deadline. There was a rush order, and those workers knew that if they didn't get that order out, the company was in trouble. They were working as hard as they can, because they knew one more rushed order gone, less money for the company. Then what happens? Did a worker sneak in the back for a cigarette, maybe by the chemical drums? He knows he really shouldn't, but it's cold outside, and he'll be real careful. But was he careful enough? You know, those drums are tricky. If you aren't firm enough with them, the acid won't come through the spout, but if you're too firm, you can rupture a seal, you can separate where that spout comes out of the barrel itself. You have to be real careful. George Avery was working, because when else could he work? At night, when the machines are quiet, he's not interfering with other orders. So he gets there at 6 o'clock, starts busily working with the prototype designs, because he knows the bank needs them. But he's not a machinist. Could he have misjudged quite how hot a machine was? He didn't work with them a lot. He was a designer, principally. Well, Chief Fire Marshal Olson didn't want to believe this fire was an accident. He had a history with fires like this. He called fast meatpacking an arson, even though police, prosecutors, and the private insurance company that backed Fast disagreed. He called Yaffink an arson, even though the same group disagreed with him again. And now he comes to the same erroneous conclusion in this fire. There's only one man in this city that believes this fire was arson, applying either the criminal standard, which we've talked about, or the civil standard, the very question you must answer. Because when the police question, they're held to no standard. When they indict, it's a probable cause standard. Is it more likely than not? And ladies and gentlemen, this is the very question you must answer. For two of Chief Olson's previous fires, the police came to the conclusion that this was an arson by the same standard you must come to. For this fire, the fire at issue today, they came to the same conclusion again. But still, Chief Olson persists. So let's talk about exactly why Chief Olson came to his conclusions. First, he says an igniter was used. Well, he couldn't find any evidence of an igniter. He says, well, maybe it washed away in the fire. But that is basically making something up. There's no physical evidence, no direct evidence, and yet he still stubbornly claims there is an igniter. Next, he says, well, the windows are open. And that gave a favorable ventilation pattern. Let me explain that a little bit, because I know that may be confusing for some of you. Fires usually burn up, destroying what's above them first. This fire burned out across the factory floor. And Chief Olson says, well, that's because the windows were open. Ladies and gentlemen, when hot metal is flying around a factory, when men are wearing the sort of protective suits that you saw in those photos, you don't think it gets hot? You don't think it's stifling? You don't think the air is so thick that they say, God, open a window. In fact, open all of them. That's the simplest explanation here. The guys were hot. It was a rush order, and they needed some ventilation. And by the time that order was done, someone forgot to shut the windows. Next, Chief Olson says, well, there was a lot of hydrochloric acid used. And this may be his most arrogant assumption. Now, I want to make it very clear. Donald Olson is a public servant. He's got 27 years' experience. I'm not trying to attack him any more than is necessary. Man has integrity. At the same time, he's wrong about this fact in particular. First of all, where did this hundreds of gallons of HCl come from? Everyone admitted there were only 50 in the factory. No one saw them brought in. I mean, how can you bring in large storage drums of hydrochloric acid with no one noticing? Next, Chief Olson testified that you needed hundreds of thousands of gallons of water to put out this fire. Well, what happens when you put water on an HCl fire? It's the same thing that happens when you throw a pitcher of water on a grease fire on a stovetop. Suddenly you've got a small stovetop fire, you throw the pitcher of water, and half your kitchen is up in flames. This is a report by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. Here's what it says, and I want you to all pay close attention to this. If a fire occurs, never add water directly to hydrochloric acid. Do not get water inside the containers. Do not extinguish the flames with water, as explosive reignition may occur. Now, explosive reignition is a fancy way of saying it will explode. It will spread the flames. It will send hydrochloric acid shooting everywhere, in debris, in the flames that come to the factory. I asked Chief Olson about this report, but I want you to see the text of this. What this means is the Needham City Fire Department inadvertently helped the fire spread when they threw water on that fire. They couldn't have known. They didn't know they were dealing with an HCl fire. It looked like a normal fire to them. But as soon as they put hoses to that water, they just spread that fire. And after 5 hours of uncontrolled burn, there was nothing left. You know, most lawyers would be embarrassed to come before you and say there's no direct evidence, no smoking gun. But Mismo's lawyers came up here just a few minutes ago and told you exactly that. You know, if this were an episode of CSI, it'd be 5 minutes long. It'd be the lowest rated episode of the season. No one would watch. It'd be the most boring thing on television. But still, they decided to make Arthur Jackson the issue in this case. And after hearing so much negative testimony about Mr. Jackson, about intimate details of his personal life, about the state of his marriage, about the state of his finances, I understand why you might have a negative opinion of him. It's perfectly reasonable after hearing attack after attack after attack. But I want to tell you some things about Arthur Jackson. When the housing market collapsed because of the greed of Wall Street bankers and private insurance companies like AIG, Art Jackson paid every paycheck, paid every benefit check, paid every insurance premium. He took care of his employees. He didn't cut corners. When cheap aluminum flooded the market from China and Russia, Art Jackson took care of his employees. He made the same quality product today as he did on day one. He didn't compromise standards. And when a lot of manufacturers felt that it was more economical to simply ship jobs to China, the Philippines, India, he stayed right here in this community. And Art Jackson thought he had found a partner in Mismo Insurance. But as soon as Arthur Jackson needed them, and more importantly, his employees needed them, they began thinking of ways of getting out of their obligation. Mismo's lawyers have dragged Arthur Jackson's name through the mud because it's easier to make the man the center of the case than listen to the legitimacy of his claims. They brought Marie Williams into this courtroom and asked her to testify about the most intimate details of their personal life. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I would tell you there are 3 reasons you must find in favor of Arthur Jackson. The first is there's no direct evidence. The second is that there is no reason Arthur Jackson needed to burn down that factory. He had roughly $100,000 in personal assets. He wasn't going to the bread lines. The theory of the fire makes no logical sense, and I urge you, let Arthur Jackson go home and rebuild. Thank you.